BYU's athletic director is stepping down. Doesn't have a major impact on Utah. We're talking about it on today's Locked On Utes.
You are Locked On Utes, your daily podcast on the Utah Utes. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for making Locked On Utes your first listen and view of the day. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, available wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube. If it's your first time listening, make sure you like and subscribe. My name is JT Wistrcill, former intern inside the University of Utah Athletic Department. I'm excited to have on a very special guest on today's show. Currently, he is the University of Texas beat writer at LoneStarLive.com, but also used to cover the University of Utah, so always fired up to have Josh Newman on. Josh, appreciate you joining me.
I appreciate you having me as always.
Josh, there's some interesting news that came out of BYU last week. BYU's athletic director is going to be retiring, stepping down. Tom Holmoe is retiring. So I think that leads to a lot of discussion. Hey, how does this affect Utah? There's been a lot of reaction. I don't know if it affects Utah in a major way, I'll say, because if BYU was at a crisis point with basketball and football, I would feel like this would have a major impact. I think Kalani Sitake is set up to be with the Cougars for a long time. Kevin Young, at least for the next few years, is set up to be there. And I mean, they're obviously doing okay with the Elaine and AJ Gambazza. So I just don't know if this will have a major impact on Utah, because I look at the biggest thing an AD does is the coaching hires. And I feel like that those are in place.
Yeah, no, I mean, you hit the nail on the head on a bunch of stuff there. If your two major sports are football and basketball, you think you're pretty much set up there, at least for the next small handful of years, between Kevin Young, who was, that was a fascinating hire, just because Kevin Young was sort of on the fast track to being an NBA head coach. He was one of the, the high regard assistants in the NBA. BYU was able to, pluck him from the NBA. And then, Kalani, there were a lot of questions about Kalani and if he was cut out for major college football, Power 4 football, Big 12. Obviously BYU had a very good season under Kalani, so he's probably not going anywhere anytime soon, you would think. In terms of Utah, I don't think there's any direct result or direct impact on Tom Holmoe's retirement. But one thing I will say is, during my time covering Utah, Mark Harlan, the AD at Utah, and Tom Holmoe, they had a very positive working relationship. And the rivalry, this and that, no, it's a good thing when the two ADs of the two power athletic departments in the state had a positive working relationship. I can remember, obviously BYU was independent football for a long time. When COVID hit, the 2020 Utah BYU game got moved. It didn't get canceled. It got moved, right? They moved that later in the contract. And I thought those two men, Mark Harlan and Tom Holmoe, I thought they did a good job of, rearranging the schedule and, making it fit. Like, another example, like when Utah wanted to play Florida in 22 and 23, Tom Holmoe allowed them to, move those two Utah BYU games to later in the contract so that Utah could play Florida in 22 and 23. So again, no obvious direct impact for Utah that I can see with Tom Holmoe retiring. But I did think it was a very positive thing that the two ADs had a positive working relationship. And we'll see who BYU hires. And, we'll see what kind of relationship develops between that person and Mark Harlan, because again, I think it's a positive thing that those two guys had a fruitful working relationship.
You make a great point on the working relationship, because as soon as you started to talk about that, and yes, Utah and BYU now in the same conference, so even if it was a bad relationship, would have been solved eventually. But I think about Oklahoma and Oklahoma State. Bedlam has gone to complete crap because the relationship, can't speak personally on the two athletic directors, but those two universities have quite the feud going on. So we don't know when that rivalry will be played again. And that's sad to me, because that is a fun rivalry when you're able to have it between Oklahoma and Oklahoma State. Thankfully, Utah and BYU don't have to worry about that. What were you going to say, Josh?
No, I was just going to, just another example. When Texas A&M left for the SEC, obviously I cover Texas now, when A&M left for the SEC, Texas and Texas A&M didn't play each other for 13 years until Texas entered the SEC. Now they're conference foes, and whether they want to or not, they're going to play each other. So it's always a good thing, especially with rivalries like that. It's always a good thing when the people in charge get along and can have positive dialogue.
And even Kyle Whittingham, Kalani Sitake, a great
Sure.
example
No
of
doubt.
two guys who get along incredibly well. I think the only way, like you said, there really isn't a ton of Utah correlation. The only way this impacts Utah is Kevin Young goes on to be an NBA coach eventually. Kalani Sitake either moves on or takes a bad turn, and the program goes in a bad way, so they need to make a change. And then the new athletic director that you eventually hire, he ends up not making hires to keep those guys in place, right? Obviously, Kalani Sitake was a good hire. Now you get Kevin Young. Before that, well, Mark Pope was a really good hire too. It's not always easy to make those right hires. We've seen BYU go through bad stretches. We've seen other programs go through bad stretches. So that's the only real correlate. The only thing I could think that could eventually affect Utah is maybe 10 years, maybe 5 years, maybe 5 to 10, somewhere like that. Maybe eventually if they do make the wrong hire and they're not able to bring in the right talent, that could allow Utah to surpass them in maybe more sports. But then this also opens the question, Josh, of the NIL difference, because BYU is able to land AJ Dumbansa. Utah's nowhere near close to that. So this becomes very complicated. And AD's also play a role in fundraising to a degree, I guess, is the head. So there are a few ways, but I agree. None of them seem immediate.
No, and that's what I was going to say. I mean, everything that you're talking about, while valid, you're talking about years down the road.
Yeah.
Certainly in the short term, nobody's worried about any of this.
Mm-hmm.
When Kyle Whittingham retires and Morgan Taylor takes over and Morgan's trying to hire a staff, back and forth to two schools, you poach somebody who knows? But in the short term, nobody's worried about any of this.
Yeah, it's not a major concern right now, but it is something that's going to be very interesting to see is, hey, who does become BYU's next athletic director too? And I mentioned a little bit just the fundraising. That is just something in general for college athletics I'm fascinated by. Like, are we going to see programs? We've seen Indiana rebuild quickly. We've seen Colorado for football too. Texas, although I think that's more a lot of Steve Sarkisian too, what a good coach he is as well.
Yeah.
You see these teams, if they have maybe even a down year, like let's say Kalani Sitake were a couple years from now to have a bad year, I feel like it's very realistic that they could bounce back very quickly, because with NIL resources, it's not just coaches selling you on a vision, it's also how much compensation can you offer. So that's just where college football is changing a lot.
Yeah, and just remember, I mean, you're going to be able to start paying the players directly now, assuming that the House settlement goes through later this spring. That goes into effect late August, and schools are going to have the ability, not all of them are going to do it, but they have the ability to start taking TV revenue, media revenue, and giving it directly to the players to the tune of, $20 or $22 million per year per school. And that's going to level the playing field that's going to level the playing field. That part is going to be fascinating if the House settlement does officially go through. So we'll see. We'll see what the ramifications are there. We'll see, who gets good and who stays good. There's a lot of money being thrown around now once the House settlement is officially greenlit.
Yeah, I mean, we even see things like Alabama's AD a couple months ago going online, having to be like, "Hey, we need more money." Like, that's like, what, Alabama needs more money?
Yeah.
And sure enough, Alabama actually ended up getting one of Utah's good corners from a year ago too. So it's still levels to this, but it's just crazy that Alabama could be one of those teams.
Yeah, the AD, Greg Byrne is an interesting guy. He's a little bit outspoken. He really says what's on his mind. The athletic director at Alabama, like going on social media with a tin cup, like begging for change was certainly interesting. You don't think you don't really lump Alabama into that group of the working poor, so to speak, begging for money. But that's where we are. Instead of building facilities, you're trying to buy a team or fund a team, fund a roster, fund a program. I remember, at the very end, covering Rutgers when they hired Greg Schiano for the second time. This was 2019 when I left New Jersey. His contract, he had built into his contract that they were going to build this, and this, and then NIL starts. And he was very public in the media about, like, we don't need the facility right now. We need to fund a football team. Other schools are trying to poach our players. Like, this is what we need to do. And you're going to see a lot more of that. I think, it's all about money and building a team and retaining a team and figuring out the NIL and making sure that on an annual basis, that you are able to, be competitive, if not contending for conference and national championships, depending on what program we're talking about.
Absolutely. I think forever, well, obviously a very long time ago, Nebraska fell off the college football map.
Yeah.
Some teams in the NIL era, it's probably going to happen to again. I don't think that will be Alabama, obviously, but there are other teams that we've seen routinely do this that could not be able to keep up. And that's something that's going to be fascinating to monitor. One thing I also find fascinating to monitor is the status of Utah football as a national brand. It's not a national brand, obviously akin to some of the top in the SEC or the Big Ten, but they built a good name for themselves in the Pac-12. It didn't go great in the Big 12 this last year. In fact, they've kind of had 2 down years. So want to ask Josh kind of what the national perception is of Utah football. We'll be diving into that in one moment. But first, today's episode of Locked On Utes is brought to you by our great friends at TurboTax. TurboTax has your back during tax season because this message is a sponsor from Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was dealing with and piling up paperwork constantly. It's just the frustrating forms never seem to stop. And then waiting, wondering, and worrying if you're going to get any of the money back. It's just such an exhausting process. Now, Taxes is easy to upload your forms with TurboTax Expert, who's matched to your unique tax situation. An expert who's backed by the latest technology, which cross-checks millions of data points for 100% accuracy. While they work on your taxes, you get real-time updates on their progress, and you get the most money back guaranteed. And while you go about your day, no stressing, no worrying, no waiting. Now this is Taxes. Intuit TurboTax. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live full service, real-time update, only in iOS mobile app. See guaranteed details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. If you want help with your taxes today, head to TurboTax today. Intuit TurboTax has your back with their experts ready to assist you with all of your tax questions right now. Josh Newman back with me here. And Josh, talking about Utah as a college football brand, I'm very curious to ask you this because I'm the guy who talks about Utah every day. I have posters up in the background. So Utah is something that is, and a lot of people in Salt Lake too, right? Like we think about the University of Utah a lot. I'm curious, especially after 2 down years, even though because in 8 and 4, they had a lot of injuries. They did some nice things 2 years ago, but still like not Big 12, not Pac-12 champions. And they haven't been at the forefront of the conference for a couple of years. Has the Utah national brand take a hit because they haven't been going back to Rose Bowls?
I think it's just a case of, I think with most teams in the country, when you're good, there's interest. Mm-hmm. And when you're not good, you're, I don't want to say irrelevant, maybe irrelevant, but when you're not good, there's just less interest. And that's sort of where Utah falls. Like Utah is not one of these, every year, even like Texas. We're talking like, years and years ago, even when they were in the WAC in the Mountain West and into the Pac-12, like they were not this like every year team where there was just a ton of interest. But let's like the Pac-12 years, when you were 5 and 7, nobody cares. When you're 8 and 4, nobody really cares. Mm-hmm. When you're winning the Pac-12, like people care. Mm-hmm. And that's just as simple, it's that simple. When, they're in a lull now, right? The 8 and 4 season in 23 was a bit of a modern marvel given all the, the quarterback issues and the injuries, and they still managed to go 8 and 4, but I digress. When you're not good, you're a little irrelevant. And right now on the national scene, they're irrelevant, right? Mm-hmm. Rising comes back after the knee injury, and he sort of this freak injury against Baylor, right? He gets
the hand.
Right, Baylor. He gets driven out of bounds into a Gatorade cooler, does whatever to his hand. He comes back. He hurts his knee. He's done. Season goes in the toilet. You're irrelevant. Mm-hmm. That's it. And now, I guess obviously I'm not paying attention like I used to, of course, but I see what they've done in the portal, and new offensive coordinator, and they're a new quarterback. So locally, I think there's a little bit of juice right now with Utah, right? With a new quarterback and sort of a new beginning, right? With Jason Beck as the offensive coordinator. You've got some new skill guys, but that's locally. Mm-hmm. Nationally, I don't think anybody cares. It's just not, and that's not a knock. I think that's just the reality. If they start hot, if they start off well, win their first 2-3 games, they play a Power 4 team early. They go to UCLA early, I think.
Or to UCLA, yeah.
You beat UCLA early, like that'll get some attention, especially with a new offensive coordinator, new quarterback, etc. But nationally, like right now, as we're sitting here on February 17th, coming off the season that they just had, nationally, they're just irrelevant. And again, that's not just a Utah thing. That's a most teams in the country thing. We're sitting here, we're talking. How many teams nationally are relevant no matter what they're doing, win or lose?
How many? You're covering one of them, Texas.
I'm covering one of them. That's just what it is. Texas, win or lose.
Ohio State, Notre Dame. So it's 5-10, maybe even 10's being generous. So is it maybe just
10?
5? Yeah.
That's my point. Again, it's not just a Utah thing. It's sort of an everybody thing. But again, if Utah starts off well, that perception will change and there will be attention. But right now, there's just nobody cares.
It is an interesting conversation. It goes beyond Utah, but like ASU, is Kenny Dillingham in right now because of his success? Like, yes, in terms of football fans, but gosh, Josh, I mean, how many college football fans maybe look, ASU gave Texas a scare. So maybe because of that, they get a little bit more love, but man, I'm even trying to think what it would take for like Utah. They're never going to be where you're talking about. One of those 5-10. That doesn't happen. You need to go on a dynasty and even that, like it just is built up over such a time. It's not going to happen.
Decades and decades. And it takes forever. Yeah.
But it is just fascinating as we see the Big Ten and the SEC separating. And there's even reports about more separation according to Ross Dellinger, some things going on there too. I even think like this is a different sport, but like UConn with basketball, I don't feel like a lot of people have even talked about their three-peat, and college basketball is a different lens, but it's really hard to be a consistent and stable brand. I think it's just going to be really interesting to see, like for Utah, what does it take for them to even become like the top brand in the Big 12? They'll go back to back, but even then, I don't know if they would be talked about or respected as a back-to-back conference champion, maybe was even 10 years ago.
It's hard to break through that. And like you mentioned Arizona State, right? Like Texas played Arizona State in a CFP quarterfinal at the Peach Bowl. And I remember the build up to that was, a lot of talk about Kenny Dillingham and Sam Levitt, the quarterback, right? And Cam Scadaboo, Texas having to deal with him. And like a lot of Texas fans were kind of just like shrug. Like it just wasn't. Of course, people went, they traveled, and the atmosphere was awesome. And you spent New Year's in Atlanta, but like the matchup was not viewed as this super attractive, like power team, right? Like Arizona State, at least in my neck of the woods, Arizona State was sort of treated as like the little engine that could. And Texas is going to steamroll them. Texas needed a 4th and 13 touchdown, like late in the first overtime to steal that game after they got outplayed in the second half. And even still, Texas fans were like, all right, shrug, like who's next? There's just not a lot of teams that can break through in terms of interest no matter what. And again, there's 10, 12, maybe 15 teams that no matter what they do, there's interest all the time. And just Utah, despite they've been consistent for most of the last 20 years, right? 04 and 08, they went into the Pac-12 like pretty seamlessly based on where they were as a Mountain West team. Yes, there were struggles early in their Pac-12 tenure, but in terms of moving conferences from the Mountain West to the Pac-12, they did that pretty seamlessly. It took them a while to really build it to the point where they're contending for the Pac-12 every year. But it's just, I don't know. There's just not a lot of teams that can attain, what we're talking about here.
There's not. I think for Utah, the only way they would get brand respect from SEC and Big Ten teams is if they multiple years in a row upset them in the college football playoff. But even that is just going to be the path to make it is something that's so incredibly difficult and daunting. So I think what Utah should be more happy about and focused on is that because of what Kyle Whittingham has built, by people who cover the sport, other coaches, and a lot of college football fans, like respect Utah. I think that's what they should be.
Oh, 100%.
They're not going to be talked about at every local bar, but like, hey, if we got to play Utah, that's a long game. That's Kyle Whittingham. That's what I think Utah does have going for them still, and that's still pretty cool.
I completely agree with that. That notion of respect, and if you run into Utah, you're going to get beat up, and they're always good on the offensive line, and they've got a running back, and they've got tight ends. I think there's a lot of respect for Utah nationally in terms of that, but that's about it right now.
Yeah. No, it is. And that's where it'll be interesting to see how the brand of Utah continues to evolve, if they can bounce back, what happens post Kyle Whittingham too. Right. There's a lot of fascinating conversations that go along with that. Speaking of coaches potentially moving on, Craig Smith is the coach of the Utah men's basketball team, and he's in year 4 now. It has not always gone to plan as Utah would have hoped it. There was a time not long ago, and maybe even still is, where people were thinking this will probably be his last year, because last year them not making the NCAA tournament was viewed as a disappointment. they're more than likely not going to make it this year again. It would take a magical run. By the time this comes out, we'll see if Utah will have bested Kansas State. We're actually in the middle of that game right now, so we're trying to keep an eye on and see what happens there. But I do think it's an interesting conversation and question, Josh, about Craig Smith. Like, should Utah move on? Should they not? Because I think Craig Smith is a good basketball coach. He's won everywhere he's been, with the exception of that being Utah. And why it's part of the reason I do think that Utah has a basketball problem bigger than just their coaches as a program outside of just the program the coach has built. That's why if Craig Smith can close the year on a hot streak, I do think Utah should consider bringing him back because I think he's a good coach. You've covered him closely. What do you think about Craig Smith as a coach? And do you think he deserves one more chance with his team if he can end the year well?
I've never been one to say, this guy should be fired or not fired or whatever. This is what I'll say. He won at every stop that he was at. NAIA level, South Dakota, Utah State. I thought that was a good, smart, prudent hire by Mark Harlan.
Yep.
When he made that hire in the spring of 21.
You got it.
21. Okay. The problem walking in the door for Craig Smith was that your 5 or 6 best players walked out the door. Timmy Allen, Alfonso Plummer, Mikhailion Tunin, Rylan Jones stuck around for a while.
Right? Didn't Booth Gotch leave as well? Booth Gotch, right? To Minnesota.
Booth Gotch left. Rylan Jones. So walking in the door, it was a bit of a tall task. And that I remember that first roster that Craig recruited / inherited, because he had some holdovers. It wasn't a great roster. The composition was poor. And then, time went on and you had injuries. They were close to breaking through a couple of times. Injuries, they just couldn't get over the hump. They lost some games. And then, the roster last year was pretty much exclusively his, except for Brandon Carlson. But Brandon Carlson played 3 years for Craig Smith. He's essentially his guy too. Yeah. They didn't do enough last year, right? And it's a nice accomplishment getting to the NIT semis. That means you won 3 postseason games. And then you're looking now, and again, I did some prep work, before you and I spoke. They're 1-9 in quad 1 games. It's just not good enough. I don't know if the roster's good enough, but their resume, what they've done is just not good enough. Now, how much of that is you are talent deficient, and how much of that is you're in the Big 12 now? Okay, this isn't the Pac-12 anymore. This is the Big 12, which is sending 8, 9, 10 teams annually to the NCAA tournament. Great win over Kansas the other night, but it's just a bear what you have to deal with in the Big 12. Now, again, not saying whether he should stay or go, but just a couple of things to remember here. His buyout is now down to, I believe, if I looked at the contract correctly, his buyout is down to $4.5 million after this season. That's not nothing, but if you want to fire your head coach at a Power 4 school like that, you should be able to find $4.5 million. But with the house settlement coming, and you're needing to figure out $20 to $22 million to pay your athletes, the appetite to fire coaches is going to be less now, because you don't necessarily have the money to fire a guy if you know that you have to pay the players $20 million here coming up annually. So we saw in football that the coaching carousel was not spinning as fast as it normally does, because more guys were getting retained because of what we're talking about here with the house settlements. I think you're going to see that same thing in football bleed into basketball, that there's going to be less of an appetite to fire coaches. Now, in terms of Craig, upstanding guy, his kids go to class. They have not been god awful. It's not like we're talking about 6-24 every year.
Nope.
That's not what we're talking about. If they opt to retain him, I would not be shocked for all the reasons we're talking about. If there is an appetite over there, if Mark Harlan wants to fire him, he can find $4.5 million. I just more of a general sense. I don't know that it's the most prudent move to be firing your head coach in this economic climate. Now, one last thing. if you're trying to decide what to do with Craig Smith, are things going to get better next year? Okay.
No,
Roster construction.
I think if you rip off the Band-Aid, like maybe the argument for that is right. Long term, you find your guy, so eventually get better. But if you're doing $4 million in a buyout instead of going in your recruiting class in a team that already is struggling, I think it's very realistic. Utah is one of the 3 worst teams in the Big 12 if they fire Craig Smith, unless they just get this home run hire in, at least just for next year.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, Gabe Madsen is out. Roster management, roster construction is now an every year thing. Like once upon a time, you could look at your roster and you could project, okay, we're going to have this guy for 4 years, this guy for 4, this guy. You could project your roster out mostly 2, 3, 4 years down the road. Excuse me. You can't do that anymore with NIL and the transfer portal and immediate eligibility. You just can't do that anymore. So it's hard to sit here and look at the current roster and say it'll be better next year, and you're going to retain A, B, and C. You know, so it's very difficult. I don't know. It's I look, as somebody who covered Craig and covered the program, I do have a little bit of interest in how that all plays out. Because remember, also, Craig Smith was Mark Harlan's first and only major sport hire.
Yes, he was.
He has not had to hire a football coach because he's got Kyle Whittingham, and Kyle's gonna retire when he's going to retire. He's not going to get fired. And just, in basketball, Mark inherited Larry Kostoviak, and he fired Larry, and he hired Craig. So I don't know. It's going to be interesting. It's not great if your first major hire flames out like this.
Yep.
I don't know. And you brought up, if they finish hot, if they finish well, that makes the decision harder potentially. You just beat Kansas. If you finish on a run here, if you win a couple of games in the Big 12 tournament, you're still not going to the NCAA tournament. But if they finish well, what do you do if you end the season with momentum? That doesn't make it any easier.
Doesn't. I think you just did a fantastic job of breaking down what a complex situation this is. When so often when things go bad, you just hear everyone start yelling, fire the coach, fire the coach. But there's a lot of factors that need to be considered, especially when it comes to how your team is going to look next year with the NIL resources and all the things available there. So this is a very interesting conversation, and one that Mark Harlan, and like you said too, like, does he want to fire his first guy? Now, sometimes you stick with a coach too long and you potentially go down with the ship. I think Mark Harlan's in a very good spot. So I'm not saying that's it, but we've seen that happen where an NFL team is like, I'm a Vikings fan. The Vikings stuck with Rick Spielman decided to stick with Mike Zimmer for way too long, and then end up going out the door together. So that's just something that can happen. And also you talked about Mark not being able to make a major hire. Morgan Scalley, that's not Mark Harlan's hire. That's Kyle Whittingham's guy that he elevated.
Well,
oh, you think it is?
I did not consider that. I did not remember that. I mean, that is.
You think?
I don't know. I mean,
that would have been hard to move. It would have been hard to say, like, no, we're not going to do Morgan after he's kind of like the most great coaches when they leave, they get to pick their guy, right? Like different level, but Coach K at Duke, Roy Williams got to pick his guy too. That often happens.
I will say history has shown that the guy after the guy typically has a hard time.
That's true.
The guy coming after the legend sometimes has a hard time putting his stamp on things. So that's another thing that's going to be fascinating. When Kyle Whittingham decides to retire, Morgan Scalley taking over, what the program looks like, how he tries to put his stamp on it, what changes, what does the staff look like? That's a very interesting situation whenever Kyle decides to retire.
It's a fascinating one. It's a complex one. And that's why we're lucky to have you to join us to break it down, Josh. Thank you so much. If people want to keep up with the latest things that you have going on down in Texas now, where they need to head over to?
Yeah, I appreciate that. Joshua_Newman on Twitter. I'm going down with the Twitter ship, so I'm not leaving. All my Texas stuff is available at LoneStarLive.com.
Awesome. Thanks again, Josh. Appreciate you coming on.
Appreciate you having me.
That's going to do it for today's Locked On Utes. We hope you'll join us again soon as we're talking the latest in Utah football and Utah athletics.